I was just like waking up every day with climate anxiety. And I was like, what can I do about it? Like, I can't just like donate money. Like, I need to go do something. And it got to the point where I realized I had to, like, I told my co-founder, I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I need to go work in climate, told our investors, and had to kind of make the hard call of deciding I need to hand over my baby and like go do my next thing.
Let's dive right in. Helena Merk is the CEO and co-founder of Streamline, streamlineclimate.com, an AI platform to source, write, and manage access to government funding, like the Inflation Reduction Act, for climate technologies. Before Streamline, Helena built her first company, Glimpse, in the video chat space, which she sold in 2022 so she could transition into the climate space professionally. Helena, welcome to the pod.
Super excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that we were introduced through a very close mutual connection, and I was so excited to hear about your startup. And every so often, I mean, part of what I do is try to talk to founders, and every so often I run into someone like you who I think is doing something super interesting and that they're super passionate about, which is what kind of prompted me to want to reach out to you in the first place. So excited that you were amenable to it and wanted to jump on.
Yeah, I mean, I think as any founder could probably relate to, is like I love talking about what we do, and then like it's my obsession, and when people are curious about it, I love to share.
Yeah. So maybe we could start there to kick things off. Maybe a little bit of an origin story. So from what I understand, you grew up here in the Bay, ended up at Duke for college, but then dropped out to join the startup.
Yeah, that's the condensed version. I I moved to the Bay as a kid. My family is half Finnish, half German, and I spent like all of my summers out there and went back and forth a bunch. And then growing up here was definitely exposed to a lot of tech and software, like literally blocks away from the founder of Apple and like all these things. And it always was just assumed that that was possible. Like you could start a company in software and change the world. Like that was like the undertone of living in the Bay. And it's a very powerful undertone. And it makes you believe that you can do it too. And I never had like formal training in software engineering or anything like that. But there was this one, I'd say pretty influential moment where my dad got one of the first iPhones, and he was really excited about it, and he was like a tech geek, and so was I. And I wanted to play with it, but my family was very much a no TV, no technology kind of household. So we made a deal that if I was productive, I could use it. And his version of that was that I would go and build a mobile app for it. And I was
Hmm.
like, I don't know how old, maybe like 12 or 13, and I was like, okay, I can do it. And like, I don't know why I had that amount of confidence. Like my parents clearly did something right, but they, uh, I just thought I could because someone else had done it. Like, what prevented me from doing it too? So I like went to the library. I was all determined and like figured out like how to build a mobile app. And at the time, there was no React Native. Like it was a slog, and I got so frustrated. The first app I built was more of a book. It was like a book on how to publish an app to the App Store because of how convoluted it was, and immediately it got rejected because they had just launched iBooks, and they were like, "This is a book. You should publish it to the bookstore." And then I was like, "Okay, I need to learn how to actually code." And then I started building actual apps and was like deploying things all the time. But
And you
I,
said what age was it again? What age were you?
this was like before middle school. So I don't
Wow.
know how old you are at that age, but um, way too young to have that level of like confidence, I think.
But have you heard these stories where like some math professor will write a problem on the board that but they don't mention to the class that this is like an unsolved, never been solved problem, and then like a student will go home and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, I solved it." It's like that mentality of, "Oh yeah, I can do this. Let's do it."
Yeah, you just have to believe. You have to
Extremely
like feel
powerful.
your way through it.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I think your story about just growing up in the Bay and that sort of mentality, I think that has rung true for myself, and I think Arvin too.
Mhm.
It's one of the reasons we decided to start this podcast, and so yeah, I think it's just really really inspirational to meet people who have that mentality, and the Bay Area just fosters that level of confidence and excitement about things.
Yeah, it's a very exciting place to to grow up, and then also one that brought me back after undergrad. I like realized I didn't want to go learn in an academic institution. I loved teaching myself things, and one of the places where there's the most amount of like learning and like hunger is the Bay. And I think that's why I like feel so at home here. I now live in like San Francisco, even though I grew up in South Bay, and that energy's everywhere. Like everyone's like constantly looking for ways of growing, and I just think that's a really exciting environment.
So you were on the path of you kind of submitted this book, or what was not a book but they thought was a book, and then prompted you to start really learning to code. Was that your trajectory into really coding more?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it took a long time to love the act of engineering. I really love product and like creating things to solve problems. So I was always looking for almost like a hacky way of like, like getting around like overly architecting something. It was like, what's the fastest way I can like get this into somebody's hands? And ended up finding Lua, which is a game engine, which let you do cross-platform development. And it was that was like my first like almost like hack into like, okay, let me figure out how to like deploy these things faster. And then through that, ended up at all sorts of hackathons. I remember like sneaking into all these like collegiate hackathons, and I was like, I'm in here, and they don't know I'm a kid. I thought I was so cool. And then through one of those, I ended up getting an internship. And again, they didn't know I wasn't a college student until I started and was going through all the HR onboarding processes. And they were like, we can't actually employ you. And I was devastated. But eventually I got that job, and then didn't do a lot of my like, high school that I should have been doing, and instead was working.
So yeah, and it sounds like you have a penchant for that type of thing. And how was it? How did you end up dropping out of college? Was that easy? Was that hard? What was this? Did you have a convincing to do with your parents? Like, tell us a little bit.
And what was the pull? Like what pulled you to get out, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I'd say it was a pull and a push. It was like 100% get me out of here energy.
Mm.
Not to say I didn't love Duke. Like I think there was so many magical moments and so many great people I met. I just was so impatient, and I think I was in like a weird headspace there's of like intense feeling of there's so many problems in the world, and I can't believe I'm here solving a problem set that already has a solution. I like could not get over that,
Mm.
and that yeah, and that feeling just like drove me to say I want to go work on real problems that haven't been solved before. I want to go do something, and ended up finding an internship at this like Series A company called Smart Car. They build this like API interface into all types of connected vehicles. It's like a platform to build so much more on, whether it's grid resilience or EV charging automation, or they back or they support Turo, the car sharing platform, because you can now integrate into all sorts of cars. So
Yeah.
I joined them as an intern, and then like a few weeks in, the CEO pulls me aside, and we had like a really good one-on-one that was extremely informative. He had dropped out of UC Davis and started this company without knowing what he was doing, and he was pretty much pitching me on joining Smart Car full time, and I was so ready for that pitch. I was so primed to just be like, yes, of course I'm going to join full time. Like, what does school have to offer me that this job opportunity wouldn't? So it was a combination of like already being kind of frustrated at school, and then having the opportunity to take a semester off, and then loving the team and deciding, yeah, this does feel like the next thing. And then the third thing on top is that I don't think any decision is as like intense as people think it might be, or consequential, I think is the word I'm looking for. Is like, maybe I didn't like it, I would just go back to school. Like, worst case scenario, like it's not that deep. My parents did not see it that way, but that's how I was thinking about it, at least.
Can I say I'm just extremely instinctually jealous of your mentality? Like, I think it's unusual and awesome. And I feel like when I was in school, I didn't yet have the mentality of like the world is designed by people just like me and I can go create it. I felt like I had to almost earn my way into that through the learning process. Whereas for you to just kind of, and I feel like you're right, it's just like to instinctually know, actually, I can just go attack these problems. Other people don't know better than me. I'll just figure it out and solve it and get there. Like that, I've had to unlearn, I feel like, over many years, the sort of built-in, yeah, someone else is doing it better than me. I'll just become a cog in that wheel. Like I've had to unlearn that mentality somehow, even though, as in the ethos of the Bay and everything, it's like you have a very distinct, unique, I feel like they're going to make a movie about you one day and it'll have the classic, beginning storyline there. That's awesome.
Yeah,
So
and
can
maybe
you,
we
oh,
yeah,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Bruce. Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, can you tell us a little about like how you got in to the current like company that you've started? Can you tell us a little more about it and like what sparked you to start it?
Yeah, really good question. So I've cared about the environment forever. Became vegetarian like back in end of high school, and then vegan in college, and um, was always trying to balance like what can I do as an individual while working in software, and I like never saw the overlap. Um, and over I guess years went by, I realized like how hard it was to not have things I cared about deeply aligned with how I was like dedicating myself professionally. So that was just like growing thing, and then at the same time, like the problem that is climate change is also growing, right? So there's like this underlying anxiety that's rising, and I'm like working on my first company, which I care a lot about. It was this like video conferencing tool that helped people connect over the pandemic. We went like viral during the pandemic and helped a lot of people build relationships. But throughout that journey, I was just like waking up every day with climate anxiety. And I was like, what can I do about it? Like, I can't just like donate money. Like, I need to go do something. And it got to the point where I realized I had to, like, I told my co founder, I was like, I can't do this anymore. Like, I need to go work in climate, told our investors, and had to kind of make the hard call of deciding I need to hand over my baby and like go do my next thing. And that's really hard when you care about what you're doing. But was very much the right decision. And I think in that transition, I think I for the first time really hit like kind of what you were talking about, Arvind, around like not feeling like I was the best equipped to solve the problem. I was like, okay, I need to transition to climate, but I know nothing. I don't even know anybody in this space. How can I actually make an outsized impact? And went through several months of actually maybe I should join a company. Let me go talk to everybody and recruit for roles. And in those, I just could not see myself joining those teams. Not because they weren't doing something great, but because I almost didn't know enough to take such a strong bet on one specific solution. And if
Hmm.
you've read this, there's this book called Speed and Scale, one of my favorite books on climate. It like maps out using KPIs, like what are all the things we need to decarbonize and solve in the first like 2/3 of the book. And then the last third, it talks about accelerants. And I think this is a framework I've really loved when looking at the climate change problem is like, you can either work on the direct solutions or you can figure out a way of scaling everything else. And in reading that and like having all these conversations with potential companies to join, I realized like, hey, actually, like maybe my role in this is to like figure out a problem that they all have and solving that and helping all of them move ahead, because I do think we need all of them. It's not like which of these startups is going to succeed. It's like we need every single one of them, and what can be my part essentially in making that happen.
And so
Yeah, and
then, oh, go ahead.
one
Sorry,
thing I
Bruce.
want to share is that Helena actually had a really great opportunity to even present in front of a huge audience of people about her idea with what was it again? OpenAI Dev Day, right? So I'll just
Yeah, that was like
to show that this is her presenting in front of a huge audience at OpenAI. So pretty cool.
yeah, that was such a cool experience when they first. It was so funny. I don't know if they know this, but when they first messaged me, we've been obviously talking since we first started because all of our stack is built on them. And they were like, "Hey, like you should come talk about your work at Dev Day." I was like, "I don't know what Dev Day is." This was the first time they were doing it, and they were like, "Yeah, it's going to be this like seminar." And I was like, "Okay, great." Like I don't know, 5-10 person roundtable. I don't even know what a seminar is. I skipped college, right? So I'm like basically not even thinking about this at all. And I'm in New York for a different conference, and I had to fly to I think Chicago for a conference, and I fly back to SF on Friday, and this conference is I think on Monday. And then I realized I have all these like emails that I missed about logistical prep, and they're like, "Hey, you need to come in for a dress rehearsal," and I was like, "A dress rehearsal?" I was so lost for why I would need a dress rehearsal for like leading a little workshop. And I get there after a bike ride, I'm literally all sweaty, and they're like, "We need to mic you up for this dress rehearsal and put you on the main stage." And I was like, nobody communicated this with me, or I'm just so bad at email. So that entire presentation was made like late on a Sunday. with my designer who was up all night helping me get ready for that. So that's the untold story. I don't think I've shared that on any public forum before. So
We'll link it. We'll link it in our description so people can take a look.
I mean, isn't that just a microcosm for your startup life too, though, right? It's like
yeah,
dive in first, say yes, and then figure out how complicated it is afterwards.
what did I even
Yeah.
commit to?
Yeah. So you were kind of saying like you surveyed the climate space, you saw, hey, I actually don't want to make a single bet. I want to make everything go faster. So that's kind of the impetus core idea for Streamline, right? Like for what became, how do I accelerate all these things together?
Yep.
And so what does Streamline do? Can you tell us like what it solves?
Yeah, so we streamline government funding for large scale infrastructure projects. And for those who are not familiar with why that's even a problem worth solving, it's because, like most government flows and systems, like there's a lot in it that is not the most efficient. One example of this is how kind of like federated our system is. Every state has their own funding opportunities, as does every federal agency. So like DOE, DOT, EPA, USDA, on and on and on. States also have offices like that, and all of them are doing their own thing, kind of on their own islands. And that causes all sorts of challenges for the person trying to identify funding, but then also pursue it, right? Because every single one of them has a different system to follow, has different priorities, and navigating all of that is multiple people's full-time job. And if you're an early stage company, you are not multiple people, and you already have 5 jobs, right? And so what we do is bring it all into one place in this like public database. We call it our Discover tool. That's entirely free. We think it should be free to find public funding for your organization. So you can check that out. We also have a paid tool called Apply, and there we help you repurpose any of your past work and help you automatically qualify these opportunities and figure out what parts you can repurpose and then where you might be missing information that you need to supplement.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in climate my whole career now, but in the opposite side of it, right? I was in solar, then I was tried indoor farming for a little while. Now I'm in outdoor farming, and what you're saying really, honestly, it speaks like to my soul and what we've had to deal with and trying to get funding, like in the sort of 3-letter, 4-letter agency jumble of trying to go to different agencies, figure out what their demand is, often redundant applications to many agencies, like a lot of wasted time in applying and then not getting funding to a lot of different places, and I think frankly like missing opportunity too. Like, there's no way we can keep track. We're only 20-person company right now. So I think I'm definitely going to look at the product and probably going to use it. But I feel like
hot lead created right on the pod.
Yeah, hot lead created, honestly.
No.
But how do you go about how does your software, how is it built to actually go and source all these funding deals that are possible for the companies and then match them to what I guess I might put into the tool? How is that doing that?
How are we doing that? I mean, it's a lot of LLMs for sure. We build and maintain a series of like web scrapers essentially that have a combination of like agentic flows and then follow traditional like web scraping as well. And then we do a lot of QA around making sure that everything's ingested correctly. We run those like, I think daily. We're gonna change that to like multiple times a day soon, and just pull in all the information, and then pull in all the different attachments on each of those pages. Then I think the more fun like ML challenges around each specific solicitation and figuring out for, let's say, one funding opportunity announcement or FOA, like what are the 100 different weird nuanced requirements that might eliminate you entirely, and we take those and we turn that into a series of like kind of like project management tooling, right? It's like a series of deliverables you need to submit, and then for each of them, what are all the different content requirements, what are the formatting requirements, and all the other kind of nuts and bolts that typically you would do by hand and it would take you hours to kind of shred the solicitation into like basically a spreadsheet of requirements and outlines.
That's awesome. I mean, one question I would have for you is, what are you hearing from customers? Like, who's using it and how is it going?
Yeah, so we're 2 and a bit years into this journey now. I think it's finally working, which is so incredibly exciting. And obviously it took 2 years to get here. But when we started, it was a lot of work with startups, a lot of like R&D focused organizations And increasingly, we've transitioned from just like early stage, growth stage companies to working with like local and state governments, to working with community benefit organizations, to working with there's this whole like intermediary web called like technology assistance providers that are there to help people write grants, but they're also all capacity constrained, right? So I found this like really sweet spot where we sell to the people providing the additional support and help scale their capacity because they're experts. And this like expert first strategy works really well, I think, for us and probably other like generative AI companies where we don't yet do everything. Like we can't help you I mean, I don't know if we'll ever be able to strategically help you like figure out like your entire like BD plan, right? But
Mm-hmm.
um, we do very specific parts of the workflow. And for that to be useful to a customer, they need to know how to do the rest of the workflow. And therefore selling to technology system providers, selling to in-house grant writers, selling to, large grant consultancies, working with, the big four accounting firms. That ends up being the sweet spot, which is not what we like started the company with and not what I kind of assumed. It's the same product, but definitely a different like go-to-market strategy.
What was take us through a little bit of the journey, right? Like, how did you land on that and where did you start?
Yeah. I mean, we started really just with the people I had met through Y Combinator. So my first company was a YC company. After we sold it, I went into our like there's like a YC climate WhatsApp group, and I messaged in there. I was like, "Hey, I'm working my next thing. Who can I bother?" Essentially, I don't remember what I said, but like, who can I bother about doing a user interview and talking about your problems? And there were several founders that kind of put their hands up, and like we sat down and they ranted to me. And the one that came up over and over again was like, "Hey, help me understand the IRA," because the IRA had just passed. And I was like, "Okay, let's figure it out and build a little chatbot and take what you're working on and plop it in, see how you're impacted by it." And that quickly grew into all grants for the energy and climate transition. And this thesis around we can help more for what you've done to what they want, and then tell you the gaps and help you write it. So we were working with these companies. That was fine. I think one challenge with working with early stage startups is that, at least in the world of grants, like the need is very spiky. It's like you're doing 2 to 3 to 4 grants a year. And as a software company, that's not really what you want. You want recurring usage. You want someone who's in the product a lot, especially if we're going to do like SaaS pricing. So we realized pretty quickly that the sweet spot was actually later stage companies. Instead of working with growth stage companies that were ready to deploy, like EV charging stations or EV charging companies that were deploying things in every state. And this became this hair on fire problem where they're constantly tracking every single solicitation from every single state and then trying to figure out how they can repurpose one state's application into the next one. Through all of these conversations, we started getting more and more introductions to the consultants that they had previously worked with or were still working with. And we realized like a pretty interesting wedge for us was like this like coordination layer between the consultants they outsourced and then the company. And then started working with the consultants directly and now work with groups like Boundary Stone or Grant Engine. And we are like their back office tooling that they either use internally or then client facing as well. So it kind of all just happened organically when like people like the tool, they tell their friends, and then suddenly we're like, I don't know, working with state governments. And I'm like, how did we get here? I don't know.
Yeah, I had a really fascinating experience recently where, not directly related to what Streamline does, but we're trying to electrify our house better, right? Take more appliances and things away from using maybe natural gas or other types of things. And in that process, our water heater essentially conked out one day, and we were like, okay, it's a gas powered heater. Like, how do we change to an electric pump, which
Mhm.
provides a similar level of nowadays with the technology where it's come, it provides a similar level of efficacy, but with a much better carbon footprint and using electricity rather than using natural gas. And
Mhm.
so we talked to an like a small business like plumbing company that probably potentially a customer of y'all's maybe, but they had worked with the local authorities, local state government, especially in San Mateo County, and they were able to essentially provide us a spare water heater while the other one came in. Because like one of the common problems that people run into when trying to get these more efficient water heaters installed is that they're not always in stock and they can't just do it right away. It might take a week or something like that. And the buyer's like, well, I can't wait a week. Just put in the gas one and let's move on.
I mean, Vivek, that exact thing happened to us, and we got the gas one because we couldn't wait for it, and the people we were working with didn't know how to source it.
Yes. So what they did was they said, hey, we'll put in a spare today. So you have water or hot water, and we will like be back in a week to kind of fix it when the actual electric heat pump comes in. And it worked out really great. And it's because of programs that exist. I don't know if it's like related to the IRA or other different state level or local.
You find a spare. Like, what did that process look like?
They just have a bunch of spares, I guess, that were used for this purpose because they, I think, are getting a lot more requests to do this type of thing. And they found that this was the chokehold. And I think that they're higher margin because like the water heater, the electric heat pump water heaters are more expensive, but there are incentives that you can use to write off essentially like tax write-offs that you can basically take advantage of, and actually makes the cost comparable or even lower than getting a gas powered water heater.
Mhm.
So like that, whatever that SMB plumbing shop had figured these things out, and I don't know how. Maybe they use Streamline, but basically they made it a lot easier and a better experience for us to actually go and do something good.
Yeah, that's awesome. I wish I could take credit. That wasn't us. But no, that sounds really cool. I mean, I think there's this really interesting trend in like HVAC happening where, at least in like the Bay Area climate tech scene, it's like the coolest thing to be working on. Like the amount of times I've seen people walking around with like HVAC is cool t-shirts, it's I think so incredibly awesome and nerdy in like such a weird way. And I don't know who started that, but I don't know if you've seen this around, but it's everywhere in my world. It's just like HVAC is like the hippest thing.
That's amazing.
I mean, one thing that's interesting, like on our side of it, on the work side of things, is like when we look at grants, it also dictates what we're going to do in the future. So some grants won't give you a grant over X amount of acres of farmland, for example. So we actually have to design our systems so that they can be granted at the acreage that's required. So it's like really very important for us to know about these things up front as we plan for a year down the road, 2 years down the road. And I feel like, we might be blind to some things that we should be considering that we're not. So how are you working with companies to figure out like not only what grants should you apply to, but hey, as you grow as a company, these are the grants that are going to become applicable, and this is the best way to navigate your pathway to continue to get grants as you grow?
Yeah. I mean, what we envision for that is very much like a guided experience, both based on like all the data that we're collecting around like historic awardees of programs, pattern matching you to like, hey, companies like you at this stage do XYZ. Companies who have won this grant in the past now apply to this next one.
Hmm.
Currently, we don't do much of that, which is why, again, we like focus mostly on selling to consultants, because they will help you with that. But I think as we build more and more tooling, like that's definitely the top of the list there is like, can we be more intelligent about recommendations besides just matching you to like what is a good fit today?
Yeah. Yeah. Because I find these like, I've been in mostly physical infrastructure companies.
Mhm.
And in physical infrastructure companies, it's very hard to go backwards. Once some design decisions are very hard to undo. And so you start to get on one track and then you're like, okay, well, I'm just on this track now. So now I better do better and better on this track. Sometimes that decision is very early when you get on the track. You don't even realize it's significant when you make the decision early on, and then you've more locked yourself in. I think maybe more than a software world where sometimes I think you can maybe go back and change those things quicker. So I feel it would be, I mean, for us, certainly it would be really valuable to be able to look forward and say, okay, are we making the right decisions as we scale this thing to not build out the wrong path right now,
Yeah. It's like, what are our options down the line? And it's funny because, I mean, speaking from like the software perspective, it's like people talk about tech debt all day long and like, it's impossible to like change this and we're locking ourselves into this design pattern. And when you compare it to hardware, like that's not even comparable. It's like, yeah, you could probably just rewrite the software system entirely, like, and you would still be way faster. So I think it's a good perspective to have, that, in software, everything is more or less, rebuildable pretty quickly.
Yeah, the other thing I was curious about is, do you live on the government side of things too? Do you, so it sounds like, you're working with the companies as giving the grants and reading the applications. To a certain extent, as you go through, we have to submit things like updates to the grant application. Did you do XYZ? Are you helping the government to read through those automatically and sort of flag issues that they need to bring up, making the government faster at either returning questions or faster at processing with fewer people?
It's a good question. We will see what next year has in store.
Hmm.
Right now, we don't. I'd say because of how decentralized this whole funding system is, every agency is kind of taking their own approach to AI regulation. And there's some that are a big no on using AI in reviewing submissions or reviewing anything someone has submitted. Um, they don't really have opinions on what the submitter is bringing to the table, mostly because as long as it's like true and good quality, like who cares how it's written? Um, they are more regulating what the reviewers are doing. So it's not something we've been actively pursuing, mostly because we're just trying to figure out how the dust settles, essentially, of like what people want to do, especially with like a new administration coming in. I mean, the new administration does have, for better or for worse, an emphasis on efficiency. And so I think there is a way to, there is a silver lining to that, I think, where even though people will definitely, like offices will be understaffed and all sorts of problems will arise, like I think now it might be the right environment basically to make a pitch to like reimagine how funding is allocated entirely. And
Mhm.
so that's how we're thinking about it. But I think right now, in this very moment during this conversation, I don't have a good answer for you.
It feels like if things go the way they seem to be trending with the new folks in town, um, it feels like it could actually be a tailwind for you guys a little bit in some ways,
Which
right?
is really interesting.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't think I'd be here. um, yeah, which is interesting. I mean, I think there's so many things I'm worried about and concerned about. But I think in terms of doubling down on efficiency, that one I'm not worried about.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I have like the same feelings. Like it feels like one thing that, regardless of what side of the aisle, whatever, like what your political persuasion is, there's this underlying thing that I think most people believe or like subscribe to, which is that there are a lot of inefficiencies, and the way that everything works isn't perfect. So, I think like it could have effects in weird ways that you might not have imagined before.
Yeah, and like one anecdote that's like grant related. So if you've ever looked at a solicitation page, if you haven't, you should because you will get overwhelmed and you'll know what I'm talking about. But basically, it's this like really long, 200-page, super dense technical document, and you need to read all of it to understand if you even want to pursue it. Um, we've talked to so many people who are on the side of like creating that document, right? Like they came up with a program, they're funding it, they're running it, they're really passionate about the problem they're solving and they are pissed about how they have to format it and deliver it. It's not like they chose to format it that way and they are not aware that it's confusing. They are hyper aware that it's confusing and they're going out of their way to like talk to cool companies that yeah,
Is
thank you for pulling this up. Like
is this an example? Right? Look at all these documents.
it's it's a mess and like if you click on one of them like they're even more mess. And this I would say is a straightforward one. Like the CEC is better than most. If you look at like a large DOE Department of Energy opportunity on grants.gov, like sometimes you can't even download the zip file and the zip file is like corrupted or empty. Like it's just very painful. And I guess the moral of the story is like the people behind creating those know how painful it is. And they love what we're doing and their hands are tied. They can't change it on their end. And that was such an interesting series of conversations for me. I was like, why can't you just like put this into a table, right? Or like change the landing page. And they're like, I would have to go through legislation. And I'm like, that blows my mind. That like for you to change how you're formatting the website to make it more clear, you would have to go through such a series of approvals that
Hmm.
nobody's been able to figure it out. And the weird hacks that people on the inside have figured out to make this more smooth is like we work with Jen Garson from Boundary Stone. She basically launched or really like spearheaded basically the prizes program. And prizes, unlike grants, just way more easy to administer. And then there was this huge push around vouchers, and a lot of vouchers basically give you resources at national labs rather than like pure cash. And again, they're easier to administer. So basically, people have figured out interesting hacks around it because they can't change the system. So I'm really curious to see how things are going to change, basically, and if they're going to change, and if they're going to change in the right way or become even more chaotic. But
Mm.
the good part is that the people running these programs really, really care, and they find a way to get the money out, which is good. But it's there's just so many more layers to it than I could have ever imagined when we first started the company.
So since you've spoken with, I mean, and have been working with people, in government, I think one thing that is a little bit murky for a lot of people is like, what are they doing? And one thing you mentioned is they're working really hard and they want to get it done. What do you think is the motivation? Because I think a lot of people have a very bad perception of the bureaucracy in general. But it sounds like what at least the folks that you've been working with have, like, for lack of a better term, like a get shit done mentality.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like I think there's probably also a bias of the people who will respond to my emails and LinkedIn's and go to events that I go to, right? Like there's some kind of bias there. But even those people, when I ask them about their colleagues, like this seems to be the common thing. And nobody goes to work for the government to like make a bunch of money, or like these people care. Like they're public servants. They're here to like serve the American people, and they might have different political views, but regardless of that, like they are public servants, and that has to be coming from a place of passion. Maybe ego for some people, but I really haven't seen that much. It's really been passion and care, and a lot of them point to like having kids and wanting to like make a change and like make the world better, and they're all really inspiring.
I think for me, the thing that I'm also kind of feeling inspired by is I feel like there's this dystopian view of the future where it's like there's two AIs, and they're arguing with each other, and there's like no other interaction, and they're just this is what like it's the whole world is in an AI bubble. But
Yeah.
I think in my brain now it's like there's this expansion where okay, there's a human interacting with an AI, let's say for grant submission in this case. Okay, then on the other end there's an AI ingesting that grant and flagging anything for issues or whatever it is that ends up getting validated by a human and saying, okay, look, here's what I flagged, here's the things. And so they're just making these people much, much more efficient on the other end. But at the end of the day, like this is a layer in between to help with it's a connective layer. It's like figuring out, I don't know, how to connect something to your computer or something and getting a different dongle that's like, oh, now I can just plug it in, right? It's like, okay, this feels like it could be, yeah, it's like a super effective transfer layer, like feels like it's going to happen now, even with websites or with these with what you just showed, right? Because it's like, maybe they can't change it legally. Maybe that's going to take 20 years to change it. But if you can build a layer, a web page layer on top of it, where now I go to that page and it's highlighting for me intelligently what to pull out of the grant or what to pull out of the application. And then I can even have something reading that page and interfacing with. It just feels like the future is going to come very quickly where the humans are now using the tools that are built by these AI bots to navigate this in a much more effective way without the legislation needing to change.
And how exciting it must be to be building that future.
Yeah, exactly. Honestly. Yeah.
It's really fun.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I know we're coming up on time here. Are any other questions before we call it? Or do you have any questions for us, Helena? I don't know.
Well, go ahead, Helena. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say I can't get the image of like this like AI to AI dongle world out of my head.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you like a broader question, which is just, what do you think needs to be accelerated more in the climate space beyond what you're working on? Like, what are some of the places you see, hey, I wish there was more work going on in XYZ to really make sure that we're still keeping our foot on the gas, probably the worst thing I could say in this situation, but we're accelerating.
Oh, no. Oh. I mean, there's so many things I'm excited about. I think if you haven't gone down like a geothermal rabbit hole yet, very much
yeah,
encourage that.
geothermal is
There's
very
like
cool right now.
so much like happening with like Fervo and Quaze are probably the two companies I'm watching most closely. With the TLDR is that they figured out how to drill better. Like it's not that complicated. I mean, it's really complicated. I just mean like the conceptualizing what they're doing isn't that complicated. Where there's a lot of like hotness at the center of the Earth, and the closer we can drill to it, the warmer the air gets, and then we can capture steam. And the limiting factor in having geothermal energy everywhere is really that it's harder to access in some places. So if we build better drills, and then we can get geothermal anywhere. And what I get most excited about with geothermal is that it's also baseload energy. And what that means is that it's constant. Unlike other renewables that are very spiky in demand and cause a lot of pressure on the grid, that spiky demand pressure on the grid from like solar and wind means we need a lot of storage. But if we have baseload energy, it plugs in 1 to 1, like coal or oil and gas. So we can have a constant flow of energy coming from a renewable source and put less additional load on the grid. So that's happening, and I would encourage people to like do some digging and rabbit holing. The other thing that I'm watching closely and just really interested in is like what's going to happen with our grid and like transmissions in general. Is like pretty nervous about it. I don't think we have the right incentives in place necessarily for the grid to upgrade at the rate that we need. And I don't know how we're going to solve that without some kind of incentives or regulation for utilities. I don't know exactly what the solution is. I need to spend.
When you talk about the grid, I'm just curious, do you mean like the level of energy that we're going to need to produce, or do you mean just the infrastructure of, because like I know with AI and everything, I know that the level of electricity required is like becoming more and more massive.
Yeah. So part of me, okay, this might be a hot, spicy take, but like,
We're here for
it. All right. You're here first. No, I think, I think capitalism is going to solve the need for more energy. And what I mean there is like you're already seeing this with companies like I think Microsoft, or was it Amazon, like
Yes.
basically reigniting the nuclear plant in New York, something like that.
3 Mile Island, which is it's I forget where it is, but it's a U.S. based nuclear
Yeah.
plant that was shut down because they had a kerfuffle.
Right. So a company is doing that. A private company has enough money to go and fund this massive energy producing thing. So companies who are getting a lot of money from consumers or like their end customers have a high need to get more compute for their AI. They're gonna get us a bunch of energy. They're gonna get us to energy abundance if you're like a solar punk person, right? Like that I think is the path there. But infrastructure to connect all these dots, I think we need a bit more guidance and or rules to change so that it's easier to add things to the grid. Like let's say you create a lot of energy with some kind of facility, plugging that into the grid right now has like a multi-year queue. Like that needs solving, right? Like that's like the weird part that I don't think we're going to unlock just by Microsoft throwing more money at the problem. So I think different types of problems and different types of solutions. But yeah, I think the moral of the story is like more energy production. There's a lot of like financial desire for it. I think that's more solvable with just like companies than something like grid interconnect and how everything will get connected. And then the other problem that I think also will not get solved by capitalism is just like making the energy transition very equitable and making sure everyone is included in that. And as we're going through upgrading everything, making sure that everyone's along for that ride, which that is probably my biggest concern for the next 4 years is like how we're going to be more efficient, but like be so in a very thoughtful way. Those sometimes are in conflict.
Yeah, solar has a lot of relationship to both of these things. Like Vivs, if you look at the grid related to solar, actually in California now they're having to pay people basically not to produce solar in the middle of the day because of the curve. Like solar is so asymmetric in its production day versus night that it's becoming really inefficient. And if the grid could transmit power freely throughout the country or even throughout the world, you could imagine you could take excess load in one place and transmit it. But it's just not the way the grid is. And so
is the problem like the throughput or the storage? Like what's the choke?
The grid is it's actually just very ineffective at transmitting power super long distances. It's also ineffective at taking like multi-source input power. So for like tons of individual power plants, now that solar has done that, it wasn't designed to have this like extremely multi-source input to multi-source output. It was designed for like single input sources to big output sources. So
Yeah.
that's one big problem. The other interesting thing with solar related to the equity piece is like there's like a death spiral happening on the grid payments, right? So if you get solar on your house, you now pay less to the utility. The utility raises prices for everyone who's left on the grid. And the grid is also more poorly maintained. It raises the incentive to go into solar. And so the people who are left, it's like the cell phone spiral with landlines is happening again with solar. And so both the equity pieces and the grid pieces are very interesting. And I mean, I agree with your sort of trepidation. I don't see where it's getting solved. It just feels like something's got to happen, probably governmental, to fix that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a super fascinating conversation, Helena. Hopefully we can have you on again in a little while and hear any updates. But thanks so much for taking the time to join. You sort of took a flyer on us here. I sort of texted you a few days ago and you were super open to it. So very, very appreciative. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. This was super fun.
All right. Well, have a good
All
one.
right.
Bye,
Thank you.
y'all.